In 1819, Constance Maillet, one of a number of women who had made careers as painters following the French Revolution, showed a major painting at the annual Salon. Le Rêve de Bonheur represents a young married couple with their tiny child nestling in its mother's arms, being led down the river of life by love and fortune. As Helen Weston has noted, Maillet's work expresses a continuing belief in the Stendhalian moment of perfect illusion and the beauty of the pursuit of happiness. It is a dream world, illusory and intangible. In Maillet's painting, as opposed to the drawings which Prudhon prepared for it, the peace and sleep of oblivion of the mother and child are threatened by the suggestion of a storm approaching in the night. It causes the man's cloak to flutter and agitates the dark clouds that sweep across the sky. This happiness could be fragile. For Constance Maillet, who may well have identified with the figure of fortune contemplating the blissful union of the young couple, it proved to be unattainable. Weston is alluding to Maillet's suicide in 1821. Maillet, who had previously studied with Jean-Baptiste Greuze, became a student of the painter Pierre-Paul Prudhon in 1802. When his wife was institutionalized the following year, Maillet became the frequent caretaker of his 5 children while continuing to work in his studio, where the two began a long-term artistic collaboration. They also became domestic partners. Very soon, according to Weston, the partnership between them was so close, the give and take in the relationship so mutual, the contributions to the pictures so interwoven, that the traditional distinction between teacher-pupil, master-subordinate, producer-assistant cannot seriously be upheld. And the exchange of ideas between Maillet and Prudhon and continual mutual services rendered make it exceedingly difficult to assess their respective contributions to the major Salon works, including this one. Evidence suggests that here and elsewhere the theme was conceived by Maillet, often inspired by Greuze, and that Prudhon, who was a consummate draftsman and of course had much greater access to live models than Maillet, a woman, did, prepared the drawings and sketches, and that she, the better painter, completed the painting from his studies. Elizabeth Guffey notes that when Maillet entered Prudhon's studio in 1802, she was already an established artist and had exhibited more paintings in the Salon than her new master. There is evidence to suggest that Maillet might have suffered from depression. However, her suicide has said to have been precipitated by Prudhon's rejection of the prospect of remarrying after the death of his wife. She slit her throat with his razor. She was 46. I begin with this sad excursus because I have long wondered if Maillet and her dream of happiness mightn't have crossed Agnès Varda'S mind when she undertook Le Bonheur in 1965, her third feature film, her first in color, probably her most misunderstood, certainly her most disputed. As Amy Taubin notes, is it a pastoral, a social satire, a slapdown of de Gaulle-style family values, a lyrical evocation of open marriage? Are the implication of the film's title ironic or sincere? Varda had studied art history at the École de Louvre, so it seems to me not unlikely that she would have known Maillet's work and her sad story. That painting is in the Louvre. Moreover, I argue in this paper, art historical intertexts, which appear frequently in Varda'S oeuvre, as you've just seen, often provide interpretive keys. In Le Bonheur, a narrative that might sound like a melodrama is shown like a fairy tale, a picture book, or an advertisement. Francois, a blissfully happy young man, father of 2 adorable children, and husband to an adoring wife, Thérèse, here they are, the happy family in the first scene of the film, meets and happily falls into a love affair with a beautifully accommodating Emily, finds himself so moved by the surplus of happiness that he confides in his wife, makes love to her as the children sleep after their picnic lunch, dozes off, and awakens to find her gone. This is the end of the, oh, no, it's not, okay. There's a little bit of a lag. She has gone off and drowned. He appears heartbroken, at least briefly, although not the least bit guilty. The word suicide is never uttered in the film. After Thérèse's funeral, notice how this is shot in a very non-realist fashion. After Thérèse's funeral and a summer holiday with his family and the children, he returns and soon his happy equilibrium is reestablished with Emily, who now inhabits the domestic space once occupied by Thérèse, the conjugal bed, the maternal duties, the bucolic Sunday picnics in the country. It is the film's visual pleasures that have given rise to critical doubts, its insistently idyllic surface qualities, pretty people and places, dazzling displays of color, accompanied by the music of Mozart, and psychologically impenetrable, improbably content characters. In her book, Pretty, Film and the Decorative Image, Rosalind Galt has interrogated the long-standing bias in film culture against such pleasures, astutely analyzing its patriarchal and sexist origins, and she further observes the paradoxical double bind that led this bias to be embraced by much feminist film theory. In her article, Subversive Imitation, Agnès Varda'S Le Bonheur, Heidi Holst-Knudsen notes that these biases are part of the enduring contradictions of the film's reception. Surprisingly, she says, many, and this is a quote, many read Le Bonheur literally, qualifying it as a mindless rhapsody, a celebration of all sensory pleasure, that's Sarah Kozloff, or worse, an insidious confirmation of women's lack of agency and blind submission to male domination. Elizabeth Sussex of Sight and Sound believed Varda took a fool like Francois seriously and reduced her experimental style to a desire to make pretty pictures, condemning her meaningless use of style for style's sake. Claire Johnston, in her much anthologized 1973 essay, Women's Cinema as Counter-Cinema, reads Le Bonheur as a portrayal of female fantasy celebrating bourgeois myths of women. There is no doubt, she said, that Varda's work is reactionary. Her film marks a retrograde step in women's cinema. It was over 20 years after Le Bonheur's initial release that some feminists, Barbara Quart, Susan Hayward, and Sandy Flitterman Lewis among them, began to see not past the prettiness, but into it, and how integral it was to the film's ironic implications, which were hidden in plain sight. This is a still that's fairly emphasized in the film in a sequence just before Francois enters into his affair. And I double-checked with someone better at French than me that it could be read as betrayal of trust, and it can. Of late, scholars, including Holst-Knudsen, have clarified the situation further, analyzing Varda's incorporation of advertising and pop cultural visual rhetoric to implicate the social forces framing the picture and those insistently happy people who seem like more like advertising ciphers than dramatic characters. In Unhappily Ever After, Visual Irony and Feminist Strategy in Agnès Varda's Le Bonheur, an article later adapted as a chapter of her recent monograph on Varda, Rebecca DeRue focuses on two parallel sequences in the film, one towards the beginning of Thérèse's hands in close-up performing a series of domestic tasks, and I'm just going to quickly show one shot from each of these. There's like 9. And then the other toward the end. This is the last of the sequence from the beginning of the film, of Emily's hands, not that you would know it, connecting these two specific sources of, this is the whole sequence, of imagery from French women's magazines that idealize the daily drudgery of the housewife. There are differences. They end on the same theme, same children, same pajamas. Connecting these to specific sources of imagery from French women's magazines that idealize the daily drudgery of the housewife. DeRue observes that this structured repetition plainly suggests the domestic housewife's replaceability, and that Varda applied this imagery to her characters to challenge feminine ideals, persuasively arguing that Le Bonheur expands visually and thematically on two influential feminist texts, Simone de Beauvoir's The Second Sex and Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique, both of which Varda acknowledges as having known at this point. Kieran Horner, in The Art of Advertising Happiness, Agnès Varda's Le Bonheur and Pop Art, also focuses on imagery that derives from popular magazines, advertising, and pop culture. This is one instance that he describes. There's a cut directly from this scene on the street to Francois at home. You can see him using soap, shaving soap. and his wife, as always, taking care of the children or some other domestic task. He connects Varda'S strategies to both pop artists, including Peter Blake and Evelyn Axel, and to friend and fellow filmmaker Jean-Luc Godard in his contemporary films, Une Femme Mariée and Pierrot le Fou. He says, through the détournement of advertising images to critique an idealized and untenable notion of happiness, Le Bonheur is a pop art film. And here's just a couple other images that he draws upon. These will turn up again in my illustrations. Holst Knudsen notes that certain stylistic features of the film heighten its aura of artifice. The extraordinary coloration and composition of the shots in the film also call attention to themselves and demand interpretation. In several frames, the focus is so blurred as to yield visual abstractions as opposed to photographic images, she continues. A chromatic alliteration visually unifies the characters populating the sequence, their color-coordinated clothing blending perfectly with the tonalities of the surrounding floral landscape, exposing the natural scene as a staged composition. Varda'S excessively composed shots and her pointedly unnatural manipulation of color force the spectator to adopt a distanced, critical stance with respect to this Edenic representation. Although it could be argued based on the confused reception of the film that spectators have in fact often refused to adopt a critical stance, the effect to which Holst Knudsen refers is similar to what Brigitte Peuker has called pictureness, a modernist anti-perspectivalism she observes in, among others, the films of Michelangelo Antonioni, who she says draws on painting, the flat art, in order to fashion an alternative conception of film space as inherently dissonant. Varda engages such perhaps similarly motivated pictureness variously, using shallow and racked focus, self-conscious framing, and richly chromatic dissolves, along with other pictorial devices, as well as, there's one of the most striking dissolves, but there are major sequences are divided by these really intensive color bleeds in this film, as well as certain rhythmic editing patterns. In Dresses and Children, the myth of domestic happiness in Varda'S Le Bonheur, Caitlin Quaranta notes amidst the film's prettiness an equation of women and nature, particularly in the figuration of Thérèse, whose dresses are often patterned with floral designs. And this clothing blatantly emphasizes her assigned role: be fertile and produce. It should be added that these floral designs are almost always echoed by flora in the mise-en-scène, and that the equation of woman and nature is echoed in the script as dialogue. I'm just pointing out that the colors that are in her floral blouse are usually in the scene as well. Francois assures Emily that for him, I meant this to be up when I said Francois assures Emily, because that's how it's timed in the film, is right before that scene, that she and Thérèse are different sorts of love objects for him. His wife is like a plant, while she is like a wild animal, and he loves nature. And when he assures Thérèse, right before she commits suicide, that to him, right before she goes off and dies, that to him the family is like an orchard and Emily a tree beyond it, which he had to explore. It's notable that this equation is much more visually evident in the film's treatment of Thérèse, who is strongly associated with nature and domesticity, than of Emily, who in her job at the post office is surrounded by printed matter. And I have just a bunch of instances of this, and I was going to tell you all about them, but my notes are missing. I researched these stamps, which are all more or less contemporary to the film. They all obviously predate it. One is from the same year, others from the two or 3 years previous, and they're all from well-known artworks by Brock. This is a medieval image, and Chagall, this one most obviously emphasized with a close-up. So she works at the post office and is surrounded by printed matter, not only postage stamps, but also images such as the one that you see screen right here. There's also a close-up for emphasis, sort of pop art cards for happy events and sad, as well as this detail about television, which will illuminate your children. And she's also in the world and at home surrounded by sort of either printed matter or sort of semiotic and pop culture. For instance, in the shot on the left, at the first time Francois takes her out to a cafe, and then on the right, at home, you see her there's a small, I guess like an album or maybe 45 record of Sylvie Vartan, who's kind of an icon in the film, but also one that really seems to echo Emily, or vice versa. She's also seen in a sort of poster pinup in the carpentry where Francois works, so as almost as if she sort of conjures Emily into being. Marion Schmidt has noted this dual construction of womanhood, traditional and modern, in Le Bonheur, with Thérèse representing the traditional and Emily the modern. But I think Varda, by associating pop imagery with the more modern, liberated Emily, is in fact drawing a parallel between her and Thérèse as much as a contrast. The single Emily, with her public-facing bureaucratic service position at the post office, occupies a role that did not exist for women until the 20th century, but she will abandon it to the more traditional domestic role once she has taken over as wife and mother for the dead Thérèse. Her freedom is temporary. I forgot to show you this. This is her home with an array of pictures of people from pop culture. You can recognize most of them. Thérèse was also a self-employed seamstress, a petty bourgeois possibility since at least the 19th century. In the very few moments shown in the film where she is neither working nor making love to her husband, she does look at women's magazines. And the one commission that she undertakes as a seamstress in the narrative is a wedding dress that she is asked to copy from one scene in Elle. And the bride-to-be pulls the magazine out of her bag to show Thérèse the picture of the gown, but instead of seeing it, interestingly, we see this, which reinforces the woman as nature imagery. Both the bride-to-be and her mother are wearing floral dresses as well. Marriage is still the societal ideal is implicated as the tradition that belies women's liberation. Indeed, one could argue that the film paints a history in continuity of the paradoxes of gender and class in French modern culture, drawing on paradigms from Impressionist painting to pop culture. Thérèse, the domestic animal or plant, a more old-fashioned character, is less free than Emily, more restricted in her worldly activities, but more supported by family and community, especially by other women. Her leisure activities are entirely connected with her husband and extended family, shown in bucolic and convivial scenes reminiscent of Impressionist painting. Finally getting to my title. Varda openly acknowledged Impressionism as an inspiration for Le Bonheur, which begins with I forgot to show you the other elements of the sequence of the wedding dress. Begins with a déjeuner sur l'herbe, one of Impressionism's enduring subjects. And Varda draws heavily on Impressionism iconographically. And I'm just going to show you a series of comparisons, starting with shot from Le Bonheur, about Morisot, painting in comparison. So picnics in the country, luncheons en plein air, weekend dances at outdoor cafes, as well as the more intimate and feminine preoccupations of the two eminent women Impressionists, Mary Cassatt and Bert Morisot. Note the television at the edge of the screen and the screen capture on the right. This TV appears here in the home of Francois' uncle, owner of the family carpentry business, in an earlier scene where it confirms Varda'S intertextual engagement with Impressionism and its legacy, as it was on and playing Jean Renoir's 1959 Le Déjeuner sur l'herbe, one of his two cinematic homages, along with A Day in the Country, to the Impressionist idylls of his father. In addition to this Impressionist iconography, Varda also stylistically echoes Impressionism, using cinema to achieve some of its most innovative effects, a forfeiting of spatial depth in favor of an ephemeral and plenitudinous play of color and light. So I'm still a slide behind. This is another series of comparisons. And these are somewhat random, because obviously one can pick other images that affect, both in film and painting, that affect the same. Here you even see a woman carrying wildflowers, which is what Thérèse does when everybody's finally gone off to sleep after their picnics. How might one ask, do such images constitute a political critique? Varda said in a 1971 interview, quote, "When you have in mind to show the cliches of society, and that's what Le Bonheur is all about, you have to show the cliches." However radical Impressionism may have seemed in the 1870s, by 100 years later, it was something else altogether and very much cliché. And although to an international audience, the milieu of Le Bonheur may appear to be small-town provincial France, it is in fact, as would be clear to a French audience, set in very much the same sorts of places that were, as were many Impressionist paintings, the Parisian exurbs with their petty bourgeois and working-class populations, their bucolic leisure, as well as artisanal and industrial settings. So I just used Google Maps to sort of identify the three main locations that the film is set in, and they're identified, at least most of them are identifiable in the film. Fontenay is where the Francois family lives. Vincent is where Emily works at the post office at the beginning of the film before she moves to Fontenay. And Créteil and the Montmesli apartments are where the uncle, Francois' uncle lives. So all extremely commutable from Paris, which is hardly seen in the film. Art historians, including among others Robert Herbert, T.J. Clark, and Tom Crow, have well established the manner in which this landscape of the Parisian exurbs from the 1860s was recognized to be, this is Clark, a special territory in which some aspects of modernity might be detected, at least by those who could stomach the company of the petite bourgeoisie. Noting that the word suburban is misleading, Clark notes that these were the areas in which the opposite of the urban was being constructed, a way of living and working, which in time would come to dominate the late capitalist world, providing as it did the appropriate forms of sociability for the new age. There, in industry and recreation were casually established next to each other in a landscape which assumed only as much form as the juxtaposition and production and distraction, factories and regattas. I think I skipped a word there. Varda gives little more form or attention to this juxtaposition than the painters of the previous century had. According to Tom Crow, classic Impressionism, the sensually flooded depictions of weekend leisure in which Monet and Renoir specialized during the 1870s, portrayed a life being lived entirely within the confines of real estate development and entrepreneurial capitalism. These images are of provided pleasures, but they're images that alter by the very exclusivity of their concentration on ease and uncoerced activity, the balance between the regulated and unregulated compartments of experience. They take leisure out of its place. Instead of appearing as a controlled, compensatory feature of the modern social mechanism, securely framed by other institutions, it stands out in unrelieved difference from the denial of freedom that surrounds it. He continues, the disjunction of sensation from judgment was not the invention of artists, but had been contrived by the emerging leisure industry to appear the more natural and liberated moment of individual life. The structural demarcation of leisure within the capitalist economy provided the invisible frame which made that distracted experience cohere as an image of pleasure. Varda plays with this visual frame. She permits just short glimpses of modern apartment blocks and transportation, commercial signage and advertising, all peripheral to the focal prettiness of family life in Bonheur, just all like the edges. She does not limit her scene to leisure activities, but she emphasizes them. They're literally the frames of the film. These are the first and last images of the film. And she gives Francois a peculiarly satisfying quasi-artisanal job as a carpenter working for a family business. Neither proletarian nor bourgeois, his workplace is shown in short scenes as familial, convivial, and relaxed. His work is not alienating. This frame allows for an illusion of familial happiness that depends upon Therese's acquiescence to her role, ceaseless domestic labor, which she performs happily even during their country idyls. So that the promises of leisure would not be tested against too much contrary visual evidence, Crow notes of Impressionism's distinct approach to iconography and style. Not only dissonant features of the landscape, like the prominent features of the factories at Argenteuil, but also the all too frequent failure of the promise of happiness, the painters consistently fixed on optical phenomena that are virtually unrepresentable. These phenomena have become, thanks largely to Impressionism, conventional signs of the spaces of leisure and tourism, of their promised vividness and perpetual surprise. Crow concludes, it was only a matter of a few years before the Impressionist vision of commercial diversion became the advertisement of the thing itself, a functioning part of the imaginary enticement directed toward tourists and residents alike. Without a doubt, Varda borrowed the lovely imagery of Impressionism in the very sort of social environment in which it originated to emphasize its role, along with its pop cultural descendants, in maintaining a cruel status quo, a bill of goods, one sold to us all, but particularly to women. The happiness of le bonheur is, to quote Simone de Beauvoir, the ideal of happiness, which means the ideal of quiet equilibrium in a life of immanence and repetition, a gilded mediocrity, lacking ambition and passion, aimless days, indefinitely repeated, life that slips away toward death without questioning its purpose.